Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. I do cooking and baking and gardening content if you're new here. And in this video, we together make an Easter dinner for 7 people, I think it was, 7 or 8. And it's my first time ever cooking a whole chicken. I've never done that before. I'm 23. I'm also gluten-free and dairy-free. So we do an Easter dinner for the family, gluten-free and dairy-free. So I adapted some of the recipes, so I will link the recipes I used below, but I adapt them, so I'll let you know how I adapt them. And it turns out delicious. There are hiccups, but it turns out delicious. So I hope you enjoy. So this is a little bit of a preview of the things that we make. So this is a chicken and potatoes, some gluten-free bread. We also made some roasted carrots. For dessert, I just made some cupcakes. So that's a bit of a preview. So let's get into it. So the first thing we start with is the bread is the first thing that I made, and I made this the day before so that I could rise it overnight and just make my day easier the next day and not have to worry about too much. So the first thing I'm starting with, and you can see my list here as I'm kind of ticking off the ingredients, is 165 ml of almond milk, and I warm that up in the microwave for about 30 seconds. Then to that I add about 52 grams sugar. I don't add exactly that because I think I spilled some. So. And then I add 18 grams of active dried yeast. If you are gluten-free and dairy-free like me, then you'll need to make sure that your ingredients are suited for your allergies. Obviously it depends how sensitive you are, how careful you need to be. So just make sure that whatever you have works for you. But I just used almond milk and active dried yeast. And then I'm going to mix it through with a spoon. If you're looking for gluten-free yeast, I think Dove's Farm does some as well, which is instant yeast. So if you wanted instant yeast, you could also do that. I like to use active dried because I like to see it activate and know that it's working. So I accidentally forgot to record this part, but it's just 24 grams of psyllium husk, blonde psyllium husk whole, went into 187 grams of almond milk, 83 grams of oil, any flavourless oil works. I think I used sunflower oil, 2 egg whites, and then 1.5 tablespoon apple cider vinegar. You want to mix the psyllium husk with the milk first and let it turn into a gel, and then you can add the rest of the wet ingredients into that bowl, and then you have all your wet ingredients in one. If you want a more in-depth bread tutorial, I can link my gluten-free bread tutorial below. But this one's going to be a garlicky Italian herb bread. The apple cider vinegar was quite a challenge to actually get into. It was a new bottle. So I just cover that with cling film and set that aside whilst I go about making the rest of the ingredients. I like to break it down into 3 steps because it makes it feel more manageable to me. So my first step's the yeast, my second step is the wet ingredients, and then my last is the dry ingredients. Here I have 165 grams of tapioca starch, and I'm getting it into my KitchenAid mixer bowl. I use scales for pretty much everything I make because in England it's more common to use scales than I think it is in some other countries. So I have no idea what those would be in cups. Sometimes I use cups, but very rarely. So then I'm going to use 135 grams of potato starch. The benefits of using grams is that it's more accurate. The benefit of using cups is it's, kind of easier. But actually using scales kind of means that you have less to clean up anyway. Because you don't have to clean up the cups. I always make sure I peg that and fold it over. And then I do 120 grams cornstarch. For my main flours, I keep them in the big tubs that you just probably saw before with my tapioca starch. It's like a cereal tub. I like to keep them in that because it keeps them protected. And when I was younger, we did have is it a flour mite? I can't think of the name. Problem, so I've always been paranoid about that. So since then, I always like to keep them in tubs. But the cornstarch I don't, because it's a tiny bag and I get through it really quickly. And the potato starch I don't, because it has a seal on the bag and I peg it over just to make sure. So to that I want to add 2 teaspoons of xanthan gum, 2 teaspoons of baking powder. I use baking powder to give it a bit of an extra oomph in the oven, just because it's gluten-free bread and it's nice to have that extra oomph. And for this recipe, I'm also going to want to add garlic powder and some Italian seasoning, but first I'm mixing that flour together. I don't like to add the salt until after I've added the yeast because it can inhibit it. So here I have I think this is garlic powder, and I'm going to use about a teaspoon worth. I would actually recommend, if you want a strong garlic flavour, or even a medium garlic flavour, to do more. I followed I looked at other recipes and it recommended 1 teaspoon, but I would recommend more. I would probably do at least a teaspoon and a half of garlic powder. And then I'm doing about a teaspoon of Italian seasoning too. Next I'm adding my yeast to the mixture, to the main bowl. You want to try and make sure that you get every bit of the yeast out there, because that's what's going to make your bread rise. And I like to mix that through, and then I add in the rest of the wet ingredients. So this is our psyllium husk, oil, egg white, all of that. Get that mixing in next. And then lastly I add in the salt. You really don't want to forget the salt though, so if you are unsure whether you can remember, you could either add that maybe to your wet ingredients when you're mixing those up, or just do it when you add in the rest of the dry ingredients, and it won't be the end of the day. It probably won't inhibit your yeast much at all. So I just have that mixing through on usually only level 1 or level 2, because you don't want to damage the mixer. So that you can see a bit better. This is a bit high, I can tell. I turned that up for a second. And that's how it looks when it's done, and then we need to get that into a bowl. So I'm putting this in the fridge overnight. I'm doing it overnight so that I don't have to worry about it the next day. So I'm going to line my Banneton with some baking paper. And then I think about it, usually I would put flour down, but I was thinking about it and I don't want it to dry out in the fridge. So instead I choose to put oil down and just do about a tablespoon or so. And I do go back and put a layer of cling film under this baking paper so it doesn't ruin the Banneton. So I just wash my hands and then I form the dough into a ball. So I put oil on my hands to make sure it doesn't stick too much and spread it around the baking paper. I give it a quick knead in the bowl to make sure everything's mixed very well. The good thing about working with gluten-free bread is you don't have to worry about overworking the gluten. So once I get it all out, I try and form it into a ball. The thing that you really don't want is really big seams, because that will kind of just come apart in the baking process and in the rising process. So that's what I get it into. And then I score it. So I just grab a sharp knife. I do have a blade one somewhere, but I just used a knife for this. And I'm just going to do 2 lines on the top. I'm not really great at scoring. It's something that I need to learn, to be honest with you, but I never really do much of it. Okay. So that's good enough for me. Plus it's for Easter, so the cross works. And that's where I put the cling film down. So I cover that, let that rise for an hour, and then pop it in the fridge. So the next thing we need to make is the cupcakes. So I'm going to start with self-raising flour, and I'm just using a basic cupcake recipe. I'm doing 225 grams of self-raising flour first of all. So that's flour with the baking powder mixed through it. I think in the US you call it cake flour, but I could be wrong. Then I'm going to do a teaspoon worth of baking powder. I'll mix that through with my spoon. Next I do 225 grams of sugar. Usually I do less than that, so I probably didn't do that much. I probably cut it down a bit. Mix that through. I couldn't have made more of a mess of this if I tried. Mix that through. I checked to see how much butter I have, but it's nowhere near 225 grams, so I grab out the other one. I use the stock gluten-free and dairy-free butter, the block one, but you could use the non-block one in the cake. It would probably work better if you had the non-block one, but that's just what I tend to have on hand. I always use the block one for biscuits, for making buttercream, anything like that. But for this, you probably don't need the block one. So to that mixture, I'm going to add 225 grams of butter, dairy-free butter. And I chop it into blocks to help it mix through. And then I'm going to add 4 medium eggs. The whole eggs, well, minus the shell. And if you wanted to make these a different flavour to vanilla, you could, you know, add that in now, like if you wanted to add lemon zest or something like that. So chuck the rubbish in the bin and mix that through. And make a mess again. This is a good basic gluten-free cupcake recipe. I got it out of a recipe book, but I don't remember exactly which one. And I did add some. No, I think I said that I added something down to this, yeah. But I did. I added a teaspoon or half a teaspoon of that. So I also had some vanilla. I don't know if I reported that, but this is a basic vanilla cupcake that I decided I wanted to make them into kind of funfetti cupcakes, which I've never made before. So I grabbed some sprinkles out of the cupboard that are okay for me to eat and added them into the mix. I'm super glad I added these because I thought it made it a lot more Eastery and fun. And it added a bit more colour. I don't think you want to overmix the sprinkles in, so I would add them last because otherwise I think they'll kind of just make a big mess in the cake. So I line my cupcake tins and I preheat my oven to about 170 degrees Celsius. And then you can see, I'm not sure if you can see the sprinkles, but they're in there. There's quite a lot in there. I use 2 spoons to fill 2 tablespoons, and I use them to fill the cupcake cases. In comparison to some cake batters, I'd say this leans more on the kind of harder side, like less liquidy, more solid side. So I tried to fill them up equally. It gives you plenty of batter to make 12 cupcakes. And I did mean to make one of these green because I wanted to make cake moss to go on top of them, but I didn't think about it until this point. So I quickly grabbed some food colouring and mixed it into one of the cupcakes. It would have been way easier to do this before I put it in, but I just completely forgot. And I just used a toothpick to mix it through. I didn't need it to be overly, like I didn't need the whole thing to be green, I just needed some of it to be green so that I could make cake moss. So using that, I made it like that. And here's the bread coming out the fridge the next day. And these are the cupcakes the next day. So this is the morning of the Easter dinner. And we had it a week early. And so I'm just breaking apart that green cupcake now to make cake moss. You know, to make it look like moss made out of cake. Again, I also wouldn't have added the sprinkles. I would have taken this batter out separately and turned it green. And not added the sprinkles as well if I remembered, but I forgot. So it wasn't the end of the world. And I did want some of the normal cake colour mixed in there just so it looked more mossy. So give that a taste test, the remaining cake in there. And I have these jelly beans that I got from Flying Tiger, I think. And I thought they looked a little bit like Easter eggs. So that's what I'm going to use as the eggs on the top of my cupcakes. But you could use other options as well, different sweets and chocolates and stuff. So next, I meant to make cream cheese frosting to go on the top of the cupcakes, but I accidentally left the cream cheese I bought outside of the fridge, so I had to make up something else. So I used some whipped cream, some marshmallow fluff, and some icing sugar, and I just do like a whipped cream icing to go on the top, so that I can stick the cake moss to it. And marshmallow fluff makes everything good. So I don't have measurements for this because I'm just completely winging it. Basically, I just did about half of the, I think it's a 250ml thing of double cream, dairy-free double cream. It's about half of that, about a tablespoon of marshmallow fluff, and like 2 tablespoons worth of icing sugar. And then I give it a taste test. And I just use this hand electric whisk. It's an attachment for my stick blender to mix it all up. It did make a bit of a mess, but not too bad. And this is, again, I'm doing this on the morning before I get ready and everything, so that the mess I can clean up before everyone comes around. So it thickens up super nicely, you can see that. Probably wouldn't be ideal if you wanted to pipe it, but we are just using it as a base to stick things onto, so it turns out fine. So next we need to turn it green, so I grab the food colouring out again. This isn't the exact shade of green like I would have chosen. I probably would have chosen more like vivid green maybe, but it's what I had on hand, so that's what I went with. And I just went about it by adding a little by little of the food colouring into it. This food colouring is pretty vivid, so you don't usually need to add too much to anything, so I was quite cautious with how much I was using. I also couldn't decide whether I wanted a lighter green or a darker green colour for the icing, because I'm adding the cake on top of it, so I couldn't decide whether to do quite a light colour or more of a darker green colour. But this is the colour that I settled on. And then popped the food colouring away. So this is everything set out. So we need the cupcakes, the icing or the frosting, the cake moss, and the jelly beans. And do ignore my arm. I have really dry skin, like eczema on my arm that you might be able to see. If you have any recommendations for that, please let me know. I feel like I've tried everything. So I pop some of the icing on there, top it with some cake moss. And I'm pressing it into the frosting. And then I double check the ingredients on these jelly beans before I add them, which was hard because it had a lot of different languages, so it took me quite a while to find English. And then I add 3 pretty much on each one. My favourite colours were the blue, the yellow and the pink. I don't know if I add those colours on this one. I might have used them more like, there's a light pink and then there's like a more vivid pink. I think I'd use the more like peachy one on this one. So that's the first one I did, and then I just carried on doing the rest of them. I was being quite cautious with the cake moss because I didn't know if I had enough at first, but as I went along, I ended up having extra at the end. And it took a lot within me the night before to not snack on a cupcake before the next morning. I'm a cake lover. And I was glad that I went with a simple dessert. Sometimes when I'm hosting people, I tend to like to do quite elaborate foods. But a simple cupcake sometimes is good enough, and it eases the pressure a bit because there was a lot that I wanted to do. So I add some of the extra moss that I had left over onto the others. And when I did the first one, I wasn't too sure on this design, but I'd seen people use the cake moss before and add Easter, like mini eggs and stuff to it. So, but when I did it myself, I was like, I'm not sure I love like the jelly beans and everything, but actually, when they were all together, I thought they looked pretty cute. So this is them finished. Each one's slightly different. And here they are on the plate. And then I do get them on a cake stand later on. And before I can clean up, I need to get the bread in the oven as well. So here I have my Dutch oven, and I'm just unwrapping the bread from the cling film, which was a challenge because I'd really cling filmed it to put it in the fridge. And I'm making sure not to put the cling film in there with the bread. There you can see how much it's risen. I pop that into my Dutch oven. And I get that straight into the oven with the lid on. I do think I should have cooked it at a higher heat quicker, like sooner, because I do add some flour onto the top of it as well. Yeah, I do think I should have cooked it at a higher heat at the start, but I was just in a rush doing lots of things, so I wasn't really thinking about it. I just wanted to get the bread cooked. I didn't get a huge amount of oven spring, so I wish I would have started at a high temperature. I think I've just started at, let me check, I have it written down. I think I started at 160 Celsius. I wish I would have started at like 200, 220 and then turned it down. But you live and you learn. I've been making gluten-free bread for quite a while now, and I kind of have it down at times, but there's times where I just take a break and then come back to it and think that I really don't know what I'm doing anymore. So I pop that in the oven, and then I can finally start clearing up everything. So I get the carrots just chopped up and into my Pyrex, and I pop the lid on that and set that on the side for a while. And then I cut up the broccoli and get that in the pan for later as well. And here's the bread coming out the oven. Actually, ironically, I forgot to serve it at the meal, so I ended up using it for the rest of the week. But it was still delicious. It's just I completely forgot in the rush of everything. So next, I get my chicken ready. I actually didn't even know which way to put it up because I've never done a chicken before and I just was confused for a second. And for this recipe, I'll link the recipe for the chicken below because the way that they'll explain it is better than the way I can. But I start by kind of piercing the skin of the lemon and adding it into the chicken. I did read the packet on the chicken multiple times because I needed to check all the instructions. And this chicken's slightly larger than the recipe, than the recipe calls for. So I add a bit of extra cooking time to make sure it's properly cooked through. So to the top of the chicken, I'm just adding some garlic powder and some smoked paprika. And I think some salt too. These are salt flakes. Again, I'm not sure how much you're meant to do, but the recipe definitely says. And in the cut there I have chicken broth waiting, about a cup worth of chicken broth waiting to go in. Then it asks for 6 garlic cloves, which at first I just put in whole and then realised it needed to be peeled. So I have to take them out and then peel them and then put them back in. I do like peel off the outer skin initially before I put it in there, but I don't peel off like the actual peel of the garlic. So then I have to try and carefully with my knife, and I should have got a chopping board out. Don't do what I'm doing here. I'm just using my hand and knife against the garlic to try and take the skin off. So once I'm finished with that, we can get the rest of the ingredients in. So we want a good few sprigs of rosemary, fresh rosemary. So I just add a few different sums. And then we also want to add some butter. And the chicken broth as well. So I think we wanted like a few tablespoons of butter. I've washed my hands constantly between all of this, so I was just in and out of the hair washing my hands. So I think, yeah, I just cut a few slices of the butter off and put it in the pan. And then added our chicken broth. And then after that, that's about it. So that just went around the outside. I probably should have put that not on the skin because that would have made more sense so that the herbs are on the skin still. But most of the herbs were still on the skin, so it was fine. And then I think I put that in the oven, covered. Again, I'll link the recipe below because I don't remember the temperature either. I think it was like 220 or something like that. So covered and into the oven. So here's the cupcakes on the stand, which I got all prepared whilst I was
Because yeah, it's certainly a
before doing the rest of the food. So these were the rest of the ingredients that were added to the chicken. So this is it coming out of the oven before we add the rest of the ingredients. So we add potatoes, cream and dry wine. And there's it gone back into the oven. I get the dishwasher on, peel some potatoes from the mashed potato, add some salt, Italian seasoning and olive oil to the carrots and get them in the oven. And then this is the chicken coming out the oven, and I check the temperature and it's way above temperature, so we're all good. So I add some fresh rosemary on top of the potatoes, and try and attempt to carve up a chicken for the first time ever. And then this is it all set out. So I've got the gravy from the chicken that was left in the bottom of the pan, the carrots, the chicken. I make some salad up. And then with the bread that I forgot to use, the next day I make some like pizza bread kind of dishes for dinner. So that's mine with the free from cheese. That's here's how the bread looked. And then I also make banana with for my boyfriend, and he has normal cheese because he's lucky enough to be able to eat dairy. And so this is how his came out looking. So overall we had a delicious meal with the roast chicken, the garlic flavoured bread, fresh potatoes, mashed potatoes, roast carrots, and we had cupcakes for dessert. So I hope you enjoyed, and have a good rest of your day. Bye!